And welcome, everybody. This is Apollo Detectives Part 6. Yes, we're back again. Oh, some of these faces you'll recognise because they're faces who've been on before. We've also got some new faces. It's going to be a bit different, this one, I think, and it should stand out a little bit, so I'm looking forward to that. So if we'll just bring in some of the people that are on tonight, just one at a time, ask them just briefly to introduce themselves. By the way, I should introduce myself. I'm Ben Emlyn Jones, and I have been a part of Apollo Detectives since it first started, and it's really, really great to still be a part of it. It's great to be here this evening with you all. So first things first, we have the welcome return of Scott Henderson. He's back again. Hi, Scott. How you doing?
Yes, good evening your time. I'm calling from Canada. It's always a pleasure to be here, and I hope we have a good show.
Oh, it's great to have you back, Scott. Also from Canada, we got a new face. So he's not been on before, but he's an author, and he's written an interesting-looking book. I actually have a copy of it. I've not read it yet, sorry, but it's actually Randy Walsh. So, Randy, welcome to the Apollo Detectives. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you, Ben, and hello to everyone over there. And just you wanted me to give a little bit of background of who I am. Let's see, my background is in aviation. I started off with private license, went up to commercial, then multi-engine rating, then instrument rating, and then I added a flight instructor class 3 rating to that. So I've been teaching people how to fly. So I teach the ground school, and I teach them how to fly in the air. So that's been kind of fun.
I think Marcus Allen, who is back again. I think you have been on you are our most regular Apollo detective. I think we have to call you Chief Inspector. You know, you've been on all of them, haven't you?
Obviously, at some point you'll say, we don't want that Marcus anymore. He's completely
When people get bored of you, we'll do that, Marcus, but that hasn't happened yet, so welcome back. And now we should go to one of our producers. It's Andrew Chaplin. Hi, Andrew, how are you?
Hello, Ben. How's your COVID-19 situation? Has that kind of disappeared now?
I've still got this lingering cough. You know, I have got over it, and of course, I've just found out that two of the guys I used to serve with in the hospital have passed away, sadly, which is very upsetting, yeah. And now we're going to move to another newcomer to the Apollo Detectives. It is Blue Earth Thing. Now, Blue Earth Thing has a YouTube channel, and if you want to know what it is, it's very simple because it's that name. And so, Blue, welcome to the Apollo Detectives. I think you're going to be probably our most unusual guest because you have a different opinion, I think, to the rest of us. So we'll look forward to hearing now. Tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, hey guys, I'm Blue Earth Thing, and like you said, I have a small YouTube channel in which I just post various videos about sometimes rockets, sometimes I go on and talk about conspiracy theorists and stuff like that. I'm actually the only one on the show, I think, that believes that we landed on the moon.
So far.
And my background in this stuff is not anything spectacular. I'm not an expert, anything like that. I just casually enjoy studying some space here and there.
We have, once again, Trevor Weaver. He's an author as well. So, Trevor, welcome back. It's good to see you. I think it's your third visit to Apollo Detective, isn't it?
Yeah, probably. 3.5 of that. My background, if someone was interested, I started a software company in 1969, interestingly. I had that until 1979, and then I went off and I was a United Nations diplomat for the remainder of my career. I retired at 49 years old.
Well, finally this evening, last but not least, we have our another producer. It's Neil Geddes-Ward. Hi, Neil.
Hello. Hi, Ben. Hi, everybody. It's good to have another Apollo Detective so quickly. So it's this is the second one within about 2 weeks. So that is obviously because we're allowed to do it because we have this freedom at home time now, so that we've got lots of time to play. Scott had found lots of interesting things in his research that inspired me to have a dig deep in some of these lunar photography things, and I found a few interesting things of late as well.
Randy put his hand up first. So go ahead, Mr. Walsh, and give us your presentation and we'll discuss it.
I think what really got my attention was 20 years ago. I happened to just come in from work one evening, turned on the TV, and it just happened to be a documentary. Now, at the time, I didn't realize what mission they were talking about. It was an Apollo mission. But then I heard them talking about the need to use the moon as a gravity assist. I knew right away that was Apollo 13. I knew that much at that time. And then I realized the commander, Jim Lovell, was talking about their method of navigation. And what he was saying is that they were sort of talking about their conversation in the lunar module cockpit. They needed to make a course correction. So what he was talking about was how the interaction between him and the other astronaut was, okay, He was instructing him that no matter what you do, when you get full power, keep the Earth within a grid pattern on the window. Now, I specifically remember him saying the grid pattern on the lunar module window. Now, that scene was actually depicted in Ron Howard's movie Apollo 13. But that's not exactly what the official version says. But that was actually done more for dramatics. What he was really talking about was that they were actually looking through the optics. Now, for those of you who don't know what the optics are, that was the part of the navigation system that they used to look through to get star sightings, so as they can then interface with the Apollo guidance computer and get a position fix. So what that told me at that point is that they were using a combination of computer assist with visual assist. Now, for those of you that don't know much about navigation, when you're using visual clues, you're not getting a lot of precision. Now, the reason why they had to use the optics, by the way, to get a position fix was for a simple reason: when keeping the Earth within a grid pattern. Of course, at that point, they had moved from the command module into the lunar module during the Apollo 13 crisis. You know, the explosion, the oxygen tank explosion, so on and so forth. And when they had swung around the moon and needed to use that as, remember, they were in an elliptical orbit. They were on a free trajectory back, and they were going to use the lunar module engine because, remember, the command module and the service module were powered down due to the explosion. So they had moved into the lunar module. So when he was talking about how they have to fire up the lunar module engine, and then they'd have to do a visual check to make sure that the Earth was in a grid pattern in the optics, that to me sounded very precarious. And that was my very first indication that something wasn't right here in terms of navigating. As a pilot, when you're using visual clues, it's actually a form of dead reckoning. So you're using dead reckoning navigation. You're not talking a lot of precision here, and it doesn't take long for you to be off course. To use that kind of method to get yourself 240,000 miles away from the moon back to the Earth is precarious, to say the least. I mean, if you're off by 0.01 degree, you could find yourself 100, if not thousands of miles off course. So that was my first my doubt. That was the first time I actually started having doubts, because I thought that was a little bit peculiar given the sophistication that we were led to believe that they were using in terms of getting there and back. I really didn't pay much attention after that, but then about 10 years ago, I started looking into it a bit more. You know, I started reading all the books. And when I mean books, I'm talking about books that support the Apollo moon missions. So I'm looking at books by space historians. You know, the one that Marcus has, I actually have a similar one. So I was looking at books like that. Also looking at the how Apollo flew to the moon. So we're not talking conspiracy books yet, although they are important. I'm talking about books that are in support of the missions. And that led me into the situation with the Saturn V rocket. Now, for those of you out there that don't know, the Saturn V rocket was the most powerful rocket ever built, liquid fuel rocket ever built. Just to give a little bit of a brief description, the Saturn V rocket had 3 stages. So you had the first, second, and third. Now, the first stage, the most important one, carried the 5 F1 engines. Now, the F1 engines are the most powerful engines ever produced. So that is according to NASA. Now, each engine produced thrust of approximately 1.5 million pounds. So that's a total of about 7.5 million pounds total thrust. Now, that thrust was needed to propel the 46-ton payload to 42 miles, according to NASA. So about 2 minutes after launch, about 42 miles. It needed to reach that altitude in order to reach its optimum orbit. The first stage separation of the Saturn V rocket would take place at 42 miles. And, of course, then the J2 engines in the second stage would take over and then help boost it up to an Earth parking orbit. Okay, so I came across some very interesting things about the Saturn V. I'll get into the testing aspect shortly. But I came across some articles in my reading, and which led me to the allis.com website. And there was one article in particular that I'd like to quote, and it's by a scientist by the name of Gennady Avchenkov, if I pronounced that correctly. So it's a Russian scientist, and that was translated into English for the Allis website. And he did a very, very mathematical prose on the Saturn V F1 engines. And it's a 60-page article. It makes some very tough reading. It's very mathematical, so it's very difficult. It takes a lot to navigate around it. But the basic premise is that he said that the F1 engines were not producing the thrust that was necessary to propel the payload into low Earth orbit. And if you can't propel the payload into low Earth orbit, then you're definitely not going to have an Apollo moon landing. So he went through step by step by step. Basically, what he was saying is that the F1 engines had to be powered back, and they had to be powered back for the simple reason that they couldn't operate at full power, because to operate at full power, they would have a total breakdown of the cooling system. So briefly, I'm going to explain the cooling system so to give the viewer a little better understanding of what it is that Chenkov was talking about. So looking at the F1 engine, we're talking about temperature in the combustion chamber to get up to 5,000 degrees Celsius. So what they need to do is to keep that engine cool, because obviously if you're not going to keep that engine cool, you're going to have an explosion. And an explosion, you're going to lose the mission. So to go through the very basics of how a rocket engine works. So I'm going to go through, first of all, you have the fuel injector, and then you have the combustion chamber, and then you have the throat, and then you have the nozzle at the bottom, which everybody sees. So the whole idea is the fuel will go through the fuel injector. 70% of the propellant will be sent through cooling tubes that were on the outside of the combustion chamber. Now that's very important to remember, because that was needed in order to absorb the thermal energy that was being produced inside the combustion chamber. In other words, the controlled explosion that is necessary to eventually lift the rocket off the launch pad. Now, those tubes apparently were breaking down, and that became very apparent on Apollo 6, which was the second launch of Saturn V and also the second unmanned launch of Saturn V. So those tubes are breaking down. So they actually tried to perform a full power launch with Saturn V, but it didn't quite work, and they almost lost the mission. I mean, the Pogo effect from the Saturn V, the launch of Apollo 6, they almost lost the mission with that, so they had to power back the engines. So the basic premise is, and he goes through this in very, very great detail, that the cooling system that they were using could not be used at full power. So if you cannot use the F1 engines at full power, then you no longer have the necessary thrust to get an Apollo payload into Earth parking orbit. And if you can't do that, then you have no Apollo moon landings. So that's the basic premise. So I went from there, and I just started looking deeper and deeper into this. After the ending of the Apollo program, it's very interesting to know that the cooling system was never used again. And to this day, NASA has now referred to using a Soviet cooling system instead of the American-style cooling system for its rocket engines. So that's another point that has to be remembered. So that's basically my premise right now. And so, I'm prepared to answer questions if anybody has any.
Thanks very much, Randy. And you've basically made two separate points here. One is the navigation of Apollo 13, and the other is the issue to do with the Saturn V F1 engine.
This is the official page for NASA for the F1 engines. It also has slightly different height at 36 miles, at 6,000 miles per hour, which is less than the 4Gs that they were claiming. There's the second engine cut off at 109 miles, and there's the final shut off at 118 miles. That's one official version. This is the other official version right up here, saying that it's only 36 miles at 6,000 miles an hour, and at 42 miles, you're almost at 12,000 miles an hour, and that's a huge difference. And if you want to see the detail that NASA has now given on this website, here's the PDF file for the F1 rocket engines, and if you click it, this is what you get.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make that very, very clear that they are actively deleting information all of the time.
There's a couple of other things that I do want to point out. I've been asked repeatedly, well, if it wasn't 1.5 million pounds per thrust per each engine, and that's 5 engines, that's 7.5 million pounds of thrust, right? Then I've been asked repeatedly, well, how much thrust then was produced? And that's a question that is very difficult to answer. In fact, I haven't seen a rebuttal to the article I just talked about that Russian scientist. I haven't seen anything about that. But what I'm repeatedly asked is, well, what was the actual thrust? Well, there is a hint up to the actual thrust of the F1 engines, but you have to go back to 1959 because Rocketdyne was the producer of the F1 engines. And this was, of course, years before the Apollo program had officially started. Rocketdyne was able to get less than, it was between 900,000 to 1 million pounds of thrust per engine. Now, that's a static test. And that data was out long before the Apollo missions were put into effect. So I find that data may be somewhat reliable. That's the only reliable data that we can go on so far. Because remember, all the telemetry information for the Apollo missions were destroyed by NASA's own admission. Because at that point, they had nothing to hide. There was no reason for them to be developing the F1 engine. They were just experimenting. And they were trying to build, there was no moon mission in the works at that point. That didn't come out until 1961. And that's basically Bill Casing comes into play because Bill Casing was working for Rocketdyne and he was privy to the actual data. And even though they got 1 million pounds of thrust out of one F1 engine, we're only talking, I think it was about 200 milliseconds that they got that thrust. So it wasn't sustainable. So you have to get into some guesstimation here. And if I was to hazard a guess, I would basically say the actual output of the F1 engines was between 500 to 900,000 pounds of thrust, far less than total 7.5 million pounds of thrust that NASA claims they were able to accomplish, which would be necessary to get that 46-ton payload into Earth parking orbit. So that's the point I wanted to make there.
Can I'll come to your picture there that you got there in a second, Randy. I mean, I remember reading in your book about the guy that was a NASA engineer or some engineer that was on site at the Apollo 11 launch who was tasked with going to cine camera film the launch from literally the launch pad till it went out of sight.
Phil Palacio, he worked for IBM and he was on contract to NASA. He worked directly in the Apollo program. He worked on a couple of missions. And he had shown up that morning to launch for Apollo 11, which is what you're seeing here. And he had his Super 8 film camera. And, he was a staunch believer. Of course, he was working for NASA, and he was very proud at that moment. And he wanted to be there to catch an historical occasion. I mean, hell, who wouldn't, right? What's interesting about his film at the time is that he shot the film of the launch continuously. There's no breaks. So for a full 2 minutes, he caught the actual launch from the pad to the claimed altitude of 42 miles, as NASA has said. He became very suspicious about the program himself. Talk about whistleblowers. This is the biggest whistleblower I've come across so far. He wanted to find out exactly what was going on, so he had submitted his film to some researchers, which I do talk about in the book, and they did a complete analysis of his film. In order for the scientists who were doing the analysis, they needed to find out if this film was authentic. So they went to great lengths to authenticate the film and then make sure that there was no mysterious splices in the film, splices that would really alter dramatically the outcome. And they verified that the film itself was authentic. The photo here that you're looking at right now is still from that photo. And I'm going to refer to Scott in a moment because Scott and Bob Williams from Apollo Detectives have done some very good work with this film. I just want to sort of say that this man, Phil Palacio, had nothing at all to invest in questioning the Apollo missions. He was proud to be a part of that. So for him to come forward, and as Scott will talk about in a second, his film shows conclusively that Apollo 11 did not reach the assigned altitude 2 minutes after launch, which is very significant. In fact, it was far lower. It was not only, I think it was about 3 times lower, the speed was 3 times lower. And what you're looking at right here is cumulus clouds, which is incredible because if that turns out to be cumulus clouds, which are far lower than the first stage separation, cumulus clouds will go up to about 30,000 feet, but these are clearly not at 30,000 feet. But to go with the official version for a second, on the morning of the Apollo 11 launch, NASA said that there was high cirrus clouds. Now, high cirrus clouds don't normally go higher than 25, maybe 30,000 feet. They can reach 40,000 feet, but it's rare. And I want to bring this point up. I want to make this point very clear, is that it's very interesting that NASA doesn't list the altitude of the high cirrus clouds. But interestingly enough, they do list the altitude of the cirrus clouds that are for the launch of Apollo 13 and the launch for Apollo 15, which is 25,000 feet. And here's the other point that's very interesting too. It was calculated, and I put this in the book, when Apollo 11 went through, when it punched through the cirrus clouds, it was not at the altitude that it should have been. But that kind of definitively shows, again, there's another point of view and another angle that shows that Apollo 11 was not where it should have been even 1 minute after launch, let alone 2 minutes. So I just wanted to put that in before. Now, let Scott now talk about this slide here and the work that him and Bob Williams are doing, which is really excellent. I'm actually going to be putting their work in my second book, which I'll get to later.
What Robert and I were doing was calculating the distance using the actual video, and you can actually take the length of the rocket frame by frame and calculate the distance it's traveling through that. And that's been previously done, and the article is by Popov on the Hollis site as well. He's done the same thing and come out to approximately 11 miles was what it was doing at. Here's a calculator that you can get online to calculate your linear motion and your distance and time. And if you use that calculator and work out the height times downrange, and it keeps you underneath the clouds, because the clouds aren't going to be more than 6 miles high, and this is separating underneath the clouds approximately 11 miles down, and the speed that it would be traveling at is just under 500 miles an hour. This chart here shows you the speed of sound as it changes over height in the atmosphere, and with height and temperature in the atmosphere, showing you the speed of sound is going. And at no time has anyone ever recorded a sonic boom from crossing the speed of sound. If you go with the official version, it's going to be within under 20 seconds from launch. It takes about 12 seconds to clear the tower. After that, it has to accelerate. And within the next few seconds after that, there's going to be a sonic boom. If it's traveling at 6,000 miles an hour at 36 miles, even on that version, or 12,000 miles an hour at 42 miles up, there's going to be a sonic boom. And as you can see, the speed of sound here in the blue changes. It actually slows down as you go up. Here's meters per second down here, 250 to 350 right here, and it's just running under the 300 up in this range here. So the sonic boom would be there, very evident within 20 seconds after the launch. And at no time has any recording of a Saturn V rocket launching recorded a sonic boom.
And just to add to what Scott is saying, I mentioned in my initial presentation the launch of Apollo 6, and I just want to elaborate just a little bit more just to show how we arrived at this. Apollo 6, it's on record, they had serious pogo oscillations. The pogo oscillations, for the viewers that are watching, basically it's a vibration of the longitudinal axis of the rocket. So it's really vibrating. If there had to been astronauts on the rocket that day, they would have had to abort the mission. That's how bad that was. Now, NASA's given all kinds of indications and all kinds of guesses as to what was causing the fuel lines to break. Actually, this is very interesting. NASA doesn't admit to the F1 engines faltering, but it was the F1 engines that were faltering that actually caused the pogo effect. NASA says that the F1 engines were working perfectly, but that's not what I have read in many researchers who actually support the Apollo missions. I'll get to that in a second. But what's important to know is then NASA then says, oh, but just in case, we did make an adjustment to the F1 engines, and apparently they made those adjustments, and then 7 months later, they launched the first Saturn V manned mission, not only to low Earth orbit, but to circumnavigate the moon and back, and that was Apollo 8. So in 7 months from Apollo 6, from the almost disastrous mission of Apollo 6, in 7 months, they went to fixing the problems without any further testing of the F1 engines. And that really was a startling conclusion for me. Now, this is very interesting. I read this from a space historian from America in Space series. It's called Saturn V, America's Rocket to the Moon by Eugene Reichel. I'm sure if you look him up, he's a staunch NASA supporter. And there's a very interesting paragraph in here from him that I would like to read. And this is regarding the F1 engines. And I talked about the combustion instabilities of the chamber, and that because of the cooling system, they weren't able to maintain the proper temperatures. You have to have that cooling system working perfectly. And I'm pretty sure of this, that the only way to get the F1 engines to work in any semblance of perfection is to throttle back. Now, here's a very interesting conclusion from this author. Again, Eugene Reichel. And he says this about the F1 engine instabilities and the problems they were having. And I quote, "The spontaneous combustion instabilities never reappeared until the end. However, the problem was never completely understood." In other words, he's saying it right there. We fixed it, but we don't know how. And then he says, to this day, it remains a constant problem in large rocket engines for which an individual empirical solution has to be found. Now he's saying that, well, we fixed it then, but we don't know what the problem is now. And then he says, to the disappointment of the engineers, a model was never found which they could generally overcome the problem. That is regarding the F1 engines and the perfection that we are told worked to get the Apollo missions to the moon and back.
There's a massive amount of material there. I'd love to know what Blue thinks about this, because I know he has a different view.
First off, I truly do think that Randy's overplaying the tremendous failure that is Apollo 6, because it worked and mission was accomplished. They tested the engines, they tested the rocket and everything like that. It didn't reach its prime altitude, but that's not just because of the F1 engine's failures. That's because also the J2 engines had problems, and the engines after that. There was a lot of problems with that, but it still succeeded. And I don't see that as a problem for Apollo. In fact, I see that as just the opposite. We have problems like this all the time where we have to fix something really quickly, and then we don't get to test it before we go out and try to win a race. And it works a lot because we understand our engine very, very closely. And that's how these engineers understood each individual F1 engine. As you know, each individual F1 engine was not the same. They were all different, every one of them. And they had specific engineers assigned to each engine to keep them running. I can see that easily as one of the reasons why there's not a single model for all the F1 engines, because they're all different, even though they're manufactured basically the same. So I think that's just a problem that happens when you get very high-powered engines of really any kind. Another thing is, you were talking about how NASA doesn't admit that there was a problem with Apollo 6. Is that correct?
No, that's not what I said. I said NASA doesn't admit to problems with the F1 engines. I never said they didn't. They do admit to a problem with the engines.
All right. If you go to Huntsville, the Space Center, and they have a little booth there that specifically is about the problems of the F1 engine.
Right, and I just spoke to that problem, and I'd like to respond to your first point, is that what you're talking about is good. It's all well good, and actually I agree with you to a point, but we're not talking about a history of engines leading up to high-powered engines. We're talking about a very unique engine, the F1 engine, that was only tested in actual conditions of flight twice for a total of 4 minutes. Technology, being what it is, always goes through peaks and valleys, and and there has to be always numerous testing done. We see this all the time in the aviation industry. So what I'm saying is that the problems that were admit to problems with the F1 engines, those problems were never retested again before the launch of Apollo 8. And I've never seen any example of that in any other industry where a problem is not fixed and then tested before an actual mission.
One, you said that the Apollo engines were only tested for 4 minutes in flight?
Hold on. Let's just clarify. They were actually tested for 70 hours in static testing. So 70 hours of testing, which seems adequate enough.
Can I just ask a question of clarification? Yeah. You refer to static testing. Now, is this, presumably this means that the rocket's not actually in flight when the engines are actually ignited?
Yeah, that's static testing. Now, static testing is important. I mean, in aviation, you have static testing of jet engines all the time. I mean, that's an integral part of any new technology. You want to do static testing first. And to keep in mind is the static testing is done under very controlled conditions. The whole idea then, you take it to the next step. You want to test the aircraft engines in actual conditions of flight. And that is in atmospheric conditions, because now you've got many different forces that are acting on that engine. So you can have an engine working perfectly in static conditions. But now you want to see if that you can duplicate that in actual flight conditions. We're not seeing that with the F1 engines.
Why would you need it in that short amount of time? I mean, first off, when the Apollo 6 launched, if you were to have people in that capsule, they would have come home perfectly safe.
We're getting that information.
I'm getting that information from just basically estimates, seeing that it didn't blow up. The capsule did return pretty darn safely.
Hold on a second. I want to know how you came to that conclusion. The severe pogo problems that were so bad it disrupted the fuel line and cut off the J2 engines. So how would they have gotten back safe?
It did damage the limb that was inside, the stand-in limb, and all that things. But the capsule in which the astronauts would have been housed in was perfectly fine.
Fine from where?
I can literally just show you a picture of it sitting on Earth right now.
No, I'm not talking about that. You can have a capsule that may look perfect, but we're talking about the contents of the capsule. What it would have done to the astronauts. Did they go into Earth orbit? Is that what you're saying? What?
It returned in good enough condition in which NASA decided, hey, it's fine that we can actually put people on this and try this again.
Okay, but what are you basing that on? That's what I need to know.
I'm basing that on the events that happened. They launched a rocket.
Yeah.
It basically accomplished what they went for it to do.
Right.
Okay. It tested the engines. It tested the things. They figured out the problems that were on the rocket.
Right.
They know what the problems are. So then they go, this thing returns. We have a capsule sitting here. We have a deadline we got to make, and we have money. F1 engines cost a crap ton of money. These rockets cost just so much money. We have to send somebody up. It's logical for me that they would put somebody in the capsule, send it up, and send it back down when it was just proven that could happen. And they have the few months to fix the next engines, make sure the problem doesn't happen again. And guess what? We saw that happen. We saw it happen. We saw the next rocket go up, Apollo 7, go up. They didn't have hardly any problems other than a cold and a small mutiny.
Apollo 7 was not a Saturn V launch.
You're right. But by the time they did send up the next Apollo rocket, there really weren't that many problems.
Okay. Sorry, are you done? I don't mean to interrupt you again.
Yeah, I'm done on this topic. I've got one more that I want to talk about with the sonic boom after this.
And I'll let you get to that in a second if you don't mind. I just want to respond to the first part. You're basing it on schedule. Is that what you said?
I'm basing it on what happened.
Okay, thank you.
So I know you want to talk about the sonic boom, Blue. But after that, I'll ask you. I've got another question for you after that about the other points. But do you want to mention the sonic boom issue?
Oh, yeah. So you were talking about how there's never been a sonic boom recorded. Is that what you were saying, Scott?
Yes, of course. You heard me. You can Google all you want. You won't find a video with a sonic boom in it.
If there wasn't a sonic boom, I'm kind of curious as to what you think that is. It looks like a sonic boom to me.
Well, give me the audio of it. That is a composite photograph you've just pulled up.
You're referring to the cloud of vapor about halfway up the rocket's body. Is that what you mean? Okay, cheers.
I can pull up pictures of other rockets doing sonic booms, and it looks the exact same.
Blue, now, Randy and Scott made other points as well. Now, earlier on, we were talking about Apollo 13 and the navigation issue, because this is something that came up on a previous episode of when Marcus and I and several other people were discussing this. What do you know about the navigation issue that Trevor brought up?
Not much, to be honest.
No worries. Yeah. Marcus, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, just really looking at what we're discussing there, I think Randy's made some very good points in terms of testing, but also the use of the film, the IBM engineers' film, which I think we can all agree has been accepted as unedited, uncut. So it shows what actually happened. And to see the rocket moving through the cirrus clouds, where you can see its shadow being cast on the upper side of the cirrus cloud, means that you can time it very precisely. Now, if you're going to achieve a certain speed, you need a certain amount of power behind you, given the weight that you're carrying. And I usually say, well, you can take a Ford Fiesta with 100 horsepower, and it will get from 0 to 60 in, let's say, 10 seconds. You can take a Ferrari 358 with 400 horsepower, and it will get from 0 to 60 in 4 seconds, or maybe a bit less. The point is that it's the power that's available to do it that moves the weight that you're moving. The same would apply to a rocket. So if there isn't enough power to move it fast enough to reach the speed it has to achieve to get to its objective, which is cut-off point at 42 miles and then launching from there up to 118 miles, you need a certain amount of power. Now, if it didn't have the weight on the rocket because there wasn't enough fuel or the fuel was not sufficient, it wasn't carrying the weight we're told it carried into low Earth orbit and from then on into translunar injection, which is 46 tons to the moon. So what Randy, I think, has made a case for is that there wasn't sufficient power being generated by the F1 engines. We know what they're supposed to generate, but the question is, did they actually generate it? Did they generate the 1.5 million pounds of thrust each? And if, as you say, it was generating, say, 900,000 pounds per thrust, that means it didn't have the power to launch what we're told it launched. I think 50 years later, we're seeing the same problem with the Space Launch System. That is supposed to be able to launch the same weight, 130 tons, into low Earth orbit. That's great advance in scientific achievement in the last 50 years, that they can't do any more than 130 tons. But that's beside the point. They still haven't launched the damn thing yet. So why don't they dig out the old Saturn V rockets? They've got an engine that Jeff Bezos dug out of the Atlantic, and just back engineer the thing. It can't be beyond the wit of man to do that. Because the Saturn V rocket, if it was as successful as we're told it was, would achieve what the Space Launch System is now designed to do. But if it couldn't do it, that would explain, A, why the shuttle had to be developed, because the thing couldn't lift the shuttle into low Earth orbit either. It took 10 years to get the shuttle program up and running. And why don't they just try to recreate some of what was successful with the Space Launch System? It's not making much sense. This is one of the major problems about what we discuss at considerable length and in some detail. It just doesn't make sense in terms of the 50 years of development which is supposed to have happened. Either NASA have gone backwards, which is a terrible indictment on them, or they never achieved what they said they achieved 50 years ago. We will soon find out if it was true or not, because President Trump doesn't like people who don't do what they say they will do, which is go back to the moon.
It does seem that progress reached a certain point. It happened very quickly within the first decade of the space race, and then it seemed to stop. Of course, there were deep space probes and things like that, and there was the International Space Station. The Russians put some people on orbiting platforms. But it wasn't what was predicted by space and science fiction and enthusiasts at the time. So that was a big disappointment. I'm sure anyone from that era who could see forward to the present day would gasp in dismay.
I think that the idea that technology has stagnated or NASA has gone backwards in technology is ridiculous. I mean, we're seeing ourselves putting incredible probes and rovers on Mars. We're seeing landing things on comets. The idea that we moved backwards is just insulting, honestly. The only reason why we're going back to the moon is so we can go to Mars, and we just got to the point where we have enough budget to even try that, and we know enough about Mars to even do it.
We're using Russian Soyuz rockets to send things up to the International Space Station.
The reason why we're using Soyuz rockets is because it's easy.
It's easy. So surely NASA technology would be far in advance of Russia.
We have the rocket that's cheap enough to do it. It's reliable enough to do it.
Because I thought your argument would be that NASA are so far in advance that they would be able to do it better than the Russians, surely.
Listen to me. Why would we be putting the massive amounts of resources in, which we did at one point? It's called the Space Shuttle, which Space Shuttle was more advanced than the Saturn V. But why would we be putting in all these resources when we have the practical use? We have the easy, cheapest way to get back and forth between the ISS for all the nations, and why would we be putting our resources there when we could put them other places? I don't understand why you expect us to be going to the moon in that period. I don't understand that.
Because I thought that the technology would be advanced enough to do it cheaply and more efficiently than the Russians would do it.
There's a couple of points I would like to address regarding what has been talked about First of all, it's important to note that the United States government funds the ISS about, I think it's 3/4 to the other countries that are involved in that. So they're paying 3/4 the cost, which I think it's about $150 billion or 200 total, and I think the United States has put in $150 billion. And that's very interesting, and I think it's a very fair question to ask. Well, if you're putting that amount of money, which is equivalent to the money they spent on the alleged Apollo missions, I think it's a fair question to ask, why couldn't you set some of that money aside to build on the technology that we had 50 years ago to be able to get their own astronauts to the ISS? We're experiencing, as we speak, a lot of political instability between countries around the world, especially between Russia and the United States. And they wouldn't do this to spite anyone, but at any point they can announce that they're ending their manned space program. So what happens to the ISS if that happens? Because if you have one country in the world that's using 50-year-old technology as its means to get to the space station, and that program ends, what happens to the ISS? And I think that's a fair question to ask, too.
To call the Soyuz rocket 50-year-old technology is basically like calling the Corvette a 60-year-old car. They keep doing advancements and they keep making it better and better and better. That's kind of the point of making the new rockets that keep going up to space. They didn't make 100 rockets 50 years ago and they're reusing those. Now, of course, they're going to be reusing parts. They're reusing the general idea of it. But the Soyuz rocket was a beautiful rocket. Even 50 years ago, it was incredible. It got the job done very well. So I don't expect there to be a lot of stuff.
Why haven't the Russians put man on moon?
The Russians didn't put a man on the moon because they didn't try to put a man on the moon. Yeah, they had the massive triangle cone-looking rocket that they launched once and it utterly failed. But they never put any research into science.
So surely they would have a better way of getting man on the moon.
Yeah, because they got freaking lucky.
Seeing as we supposedly did land someone on the moon, why didn't we keep going there?
But there's a contradiction between the argument that the Russians have made a fantastically beautiful rocket that's almost far in advance of anything that the Americans have created.
It wasn't far in advance of anything. It did its job perfectly.
Okay, but then why did they just stop?
They didn't just stop. They're still doing it to this day. They made rockets and they made technology that landed on Venus. They were the first ones to do that.
Fantastic. So how come they haven't sent a man to the moon?
Well, currently there's no reason to. They got beat to the moon. America did all the science. And there's been no reason to go back.
That's not about competition. It's about whoever got there first. Big deal. The point is that Trump recently announced that there's important minerals that need to be mined off the moon, and they want to send a manned mission back.
That's not why they're going back. They're going back to learn how to go to Mars.
Well, how about we learn how to go to the moon first?
We already know how to go to the moon. We've done it 6 times. And as of right now, no one has been able to put together a relatively good argument to say that they didn't.
I think that's the point we're trying to make, though, with this series of programs.
I have a question. It's concerning the navigation, if I may. Randy talked about the points of navigation on Apollo 13. You mention it in the book, and they used like a scope.
It was actually called sextant.
Sextant, that's right. So it's almost like a periscope, I gathered, where they could look through and they'd see the stars through it and line up the stars with their scale or something.
Yeah. So basically, what they modeled it after was celestial navigation that sailors have been using for hundreds of years. And they would use the stars in alignment with the Earth's horizon and, get a position fix and then plan their course. But it's important to note, that celestial navigation doesn't maintain course. It just gives you a position fix, and then you have to project where you're going from there. That's the method that the Apollo guidance computer used. The Apollo guidance computer required crude interface. So it required them looking through the optics, the sextant. So you'd have a telescope at 1 times magnification, and one I think was at 60 times magnification to get to 2 star sightings. And then they'll take readings from the star sightings and either the Earth's horizon and the moon's horizon, and then put those coordinates into the Apollo guidance computer, and then use that to align the inertial measuring unit as well as get a position fix, and then project where you're going from there. That was their method of navigation.
Okay.
If anybody can see a problem with that, I don't know how else to explain it.
No, that's very good. So what I'm getting at is the Apollo 11 press conference when they returned from their mission. Sir Patrick Moore, British astronomer of late, asked the crew, could you see the stars from the surface of the moon? And there was a kind of slight pause and an embarrassment and things like that, and a shuffling of feet and pens. And then Mike Collins, who was the navigator, says, I don't remember seeing any stars. And he wasn't even the guy that went down onto the moon. So my point is, if he's saying, I don't remember seeing any stars, and yet he was the guy supposedly looking through this sextant device at stars to get them there and back.
Yeah, can I speak to that? That's a very interesting point. And we have to also keep in mind that on the Gemini missions, I believe Mike Collins was talking about the abundance of stars that he was able to see while in low Earth orbit. And also keep in mind that for half of his orbit around the moon, he was on the dark side of the moon. So he would have seen the stars very clearly. If he didn't see them on the other side, he certainly would have saw them there. But as you pointed out, he wasn't on the lunar surface. You see, he was correcting Neil Armstrong. Neil Armstrong actually made a mistake. So he was trying to correct for him. And in the transcripts, I haven't got it here, but in the transcripts, that's actually reversed, which is very interesting point in of itself. That's a matter for another time. But I just want to add a footnote to that, because a lot of people would say to me, well, Randy, there was no photos of the stars on the lunar surface because of the cameras. They weren't set for that. The aperture wasn't set for that reading. Now, I'm not an expert. Don't pretend to be when it comes to photographic evidence. But my argument is, okay, that makes sense to me, actually. I can accept that. Why not bring another camera? Now, they did, apparently, on Apollo 16. They brought the ultraviolet light camera that was supposed to have taken some star patterns from the lunar surface, but that was the only one. With all that technology, it could have easily brought another camera. But there's one more point I want to make. I'm just going by the official transcripts. So when Mike Collins was in orbit around the moon, while Neil and Buzz were allegedly walking on the moon, the service camera, and I think Scott has some photos of this, was taking continuous photos of the stars. And I can't find those photos anywhere. So I contacted NASA, and I was redirected to several other agencies, and none of them had those photos, which, again, find a little peculiar. I just want to point that out.
Now, Marcus, you've this idea of light and photography is your speciality.
Yeah.
Have you heard of these? The photographs were taken in orbit and things like that. Can you add anything to that?
There were certainly photographs taken in orbit, but most of them were taken on the lunar surface. And I think it's a very valid point to say that, yes, there were supposedly photographs taken from the command module the whole time that it was in orbit around the moon. But if the photographs don't exist or can't be found, could the answer be that the camera was retrieved doing a spacewalk on the return journey back to the Earth, assuming they were on the moon? They had to do a spacewalk to recover the camera. Now, we already established in other areas that photographic film does not survive in a vacuum, and we know that there will be a vacuum in space. Could it be that the camera was recovered, but the film was so badly damaged it showed nothing? I don't know. It's a red flag that the photographs that allegedly were taken by this command module camera don't appear to exist. And there are so many anomalies around the photographic evidence, which is basically what is put forward by many people as being definitive evidence for man setting foot on the lunar surface. There are so many problems with it.
Marcus, did you say that you've got some new evidence that's not been seen before?
It's going back to what we were discussing at the end of our last episode, which was from this book, For All Mankind. Now, this was the first book that I bought. It was published for the 20th anniversary in 1989. For All Mankind, it's taken from the plaque that Apollo 11 had, We Come in Peace for All Mankind, written by Harry Hurt III. And it's a pretty standard book in terms of what it recounts of the Apollo program, and it's pretty straightforward. It's amusingly written. Harry Hurt's a good author. But at the end of the book, right at the end, I'd just like to read a very, very short passage. It's what struck me at the time, and this is 1990, I bought the book. It's in the epilogue of his book. The Message of Apollo says, shortly after the Apollo 11 and 12 missions, NASA Public Affairs Officer Julian Scheer mischievously fueled the flames of doubt at the 10th annual meeting of a drinking fraternity known as the Man Will Never Fly Memorial Society. Scheer delighted some 200 admittedly inebriated members of the society by narrating a film of astronaut training exercises at a terrestrial moonscape in Michigan that bore an indistinguishable resemblance to the real lunar surface. The purpose of this film is to indicate that you can really fake things on the ground to the point of deception. Scheer informed his audience, deliberately inviting them to come to your own decision about whether or not man actually walked on the moon. Now, of course, that can be totally dismissed as being just a bit of humour, but why even bother to mention it? Why is it necessary? Julian Scheer, who was a PR man for NASA, he was quite a prominent person around at the time. He was with NASA for many years. Why would he bother to narrate a film deceptively informing the audience that this was on the lunar surface? It makes no sense. And it was probably that one paragraph which piqued my interest to the point where 29 years later, trying to find the answer to that question. Was it real or was it not? I'm still working on it. I mean, this is £50 worth of book. This is Norman Mailer's account of the Apollo 11 missions, Moonfire. It's a great book, huge book. And then there's the even bigger one by Andrew Chaikin, Man on the Moon, in 3 volumes. But God,
That's quite a lot, yeah.
how much information do you need? It's all there.
Neil, you were asking about the cameras on the CSM.
Yeah.
That's right.
There's the camera on the CSM, and this one shows where they're located on here.
Uh-huh.
This image here on the left-hand side is when they're so-called returning from the moon, and they're going to redock with the CSM. And this is the image that they shot. This is the claim shot. This is a complete error in simulation is what you're looking at here, because all of the lens covers, they're completely covered over. And this is after. None of the lens covers are off. They're all covered over here. That's the location of them. That's the very first thing you're going to see on them. Now, the other thing is, they only did one spacewalk. And there's a picture of the spacewalk of them picking up the panoramic camera magazine. Just one. Here's the official table for the panoramic camera, the mapping camera, and the photographic camera that was on the outside of the CSM. It's official that there was only one spacewalk to pick up the magazine. However, they had to go out 9 different times because there's 9 different magazines for the panoramic camera. They had 5 more for the mapping camera on the outside of this craft. There's only one recorded spacewalk when they picked it up. The other point being is these film cartridges had to be loaded at launch. They had to go through the atmosphere, the temperature ranges in the atmosphere on the outside of the vehicle, and they had to go through the Van Allen belts on the outside of the vehicle.
And was it pressurized?
Absolutely not.
Not pressurized, okay.
Nothing pressurized on the outside of that. For the full video, they only picked up one magazine and brought it back in.
And of course, one point to remember about the radiation is that we all talk about the Van Allen belts as if nothing happens beyond them. The point is that the space is full of radiation beyond the Van Allen belts.
Right. There's a different shot, and there's the actual camera shots of them. They're not pressurized. And the magazine that he picked up was that magazine cartridge right there from the Stellar camera.
What were the photographs taken by those cameras? Have we
I
seen?
can't get a hold of any of those images.
Would some of them be of the lunar surface? I seem to recall seeing images of the lunar surface, supposedly taken by Mike Collins or whoever the astronaut was in the capsule at the time.
They were supposedly mapping the lunar surface at the same time taking photos of the stars from lunar orbit.
There's the frame numbers of the photographs that were taken from the outside. And I don't know how you can get the camera mounted vertically or whatever when it's supposed to be in barbecue mode. I don't know how you do that when you're orbiting. Okay. That's another little anomaly. Here are the photo numbers that are supposed to be taken from that mapping camera.
Right. And have you found any of them?
No. I've searched for these on the NASA site. I've Google searched it everywhere else. And from their other adjacent sites, I've looked at MIT, Harvard, and the University of Indiana.
There's a lot of them here. I mean, Yeah, 2000, was it 2000 something? There's a lot of shots were taken.
Because they didn't even have the covers taken off of any of the equipment here.
Maybe that's why there's no pictures, because they forgot to take the covers off. You know, we've all done that in the past with old cameras.
And see this little mailbox here?
Yeah.
This thing launched a little tiny satellite out. That's where it was located. Now you have to realize that you could not get in the back side of this part of the sim. You're confined to the capsule only. So I don't know how any of that equipment worked in there. That's just some more unusual anomalies.
I was going to say, Scott, whilst you're here, you could maybe show Blue Earth Thing some of the stuff that you first showed us. What's your opinion of the wet flag?
It's a really bad argument. I don't see an issue with the wet flag now. I know I've seen it before, and I know I've seen the arguments against it. I can't really think of it right now because it's been a while. When I found the wet flag argument, that must have been early December. All I remember is that I saw an argument that demonstrated to me there's no problem there.
The only argument I've seen against the wet flag is it's a shadow.
Yeah, and I can't see it being a shadow. I looked at it carefully, and you can see the shadows, and then you can see the damp.
Does that look wet to you, Maddox?
Actually, what that looks like to me, it looks like dried water.
These images are supposed to be taken halfway to the moon in
Okay.
zero gravity.
Okay.
Why is it running?
And any moisture would immediately outgas.
I don't know.
There wouldn't be any residue left over.
I don't know. This is the first time I've seen these three images. So I don't know any history behind them, and I'm taking y'all's words for everything that's said about it. I'd have to do my own research on it.
I would suggest is that anything you can't answer or you're not sure about, you can certainly go back with what we're giving you and come back another time and say, yeah, I found an answer, you know.
Here's the outside of the window with the rain guard on it that's broken. Duct tape on. Why would that be on a spacecraft? Why would a rain guard be on the spacecraft?
It's got duct tape all over it.
I don't know the context of that image.
Okay. Fair enough.
Yeah, and my question would be, why would those pictures be taken in the first place if it so obviously debunks the moon landing?
Yeah, there's several possibilities here, Blue. One of those is that it was simply an accident, and the other is that there were certain people who were taking these photographs who were actually secretly trying to get the word out. I know Mary Bennett and David Percy have talked about this, the whistleblowers.
Okay.
How about this photograph just for fun? I'm just pulling them up just random here for fun.
Yeah.
This is supposed to be the Earth, right there.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay? Well, if you're on the moon, that should be the Earth. You see the direction the sunlight is hitting the Earth at?
Okay.
Why is this lit up down here? They're not even above the Terminator line. This should be a complete darkness.
Well, obviously the LM is much darker than the Earth. You could tell that because the Earth is extremely bright and the LM is still dark.
They're in total darkness. The sun hasn't come up on the surface of the moon here yet. Here's the antenna pointing straight down. So
Yeah,
they
but-
can't possibly be communicating with the Earth because this is not lined up with it at all. It's just pointing down.
When were they on the moon in complete darkness?
That's why the book was called Dark Moon.
If you look at the angle that the sun is hitting the Earth at, the moon would not be lit up. Just look at the angle that the sun is hitting the Earth at.
You know the camera's tilted, right?
Well, he's pointing it straight up, which is a very difficult thing to do when it's trapped on your chest.
Yeah. So why is this lit up under here? How come this can
It's light
communicate when this thing's pointing at the ground?
Light bounces. And a lot of light bounces off the surface of the moon.
It'd be important, I think, to work out what mission this was when this photo was taken, and it makes possible there's an anomaly with the phase of the Earth and the lighting effects.
I don't see why you would think that this picture was taken while the moon was dark.
Now, Marcus, you said something out of the book being called Dark Moon. That's Bennett and Percy's book. Could you explain a bit more about that, please?
Okay, it was called Dark Moon because looking at Apollo 13, if it had landed when it was supposed to land and it hadn't had the oxygen tank explosion and had to return to Earth, if it had landed when it was scheduled to land, it would have landed in darkness. And that can be calculated using Celestron or any of the other lunar programs to show where on the moon at any given time, on a given date, the Terminator will be, if that's what you want to find. And it was several miles beyond the terminator, so it would have been in darkness, which makes no sense at all, because it would be very hard to land in darkness on the moon on only the third mission. This is Apollo 13. There are so many other anomalies with Apollo 13 that one has to question whether it actually got off low Earth orbit in the first place. Because what was a capsule doing being recovered by the Soviet Navy from the Bay of Biscay the day after Apollo 13 launched? Which does seem a bit strange, because it wasn't supposed to go anywhere near the Bay of Biscay, any launch. But if the Russian Navy were on an exercise, they were expecting something to happen. They knew when the launch was going to take place, April the 11th. On April the 12th, the Russian Navy recovered an Apollo command module from the Bay of Biscay. They put it onto one of their ships, took it back to Murmansk, and handed it back to the Americans 6 months later. It's now on display at Grand Rapids in Michigan, but it's sealed until 2076. So there is a serious anomaly here. That recovery of the command module was reported in the Russian press. It was reported in Stars and Stripes, the American military magazine, but that was all. Until somebody started looking into the events that took place, and they were very, very strange and weird events. And what the hell was an Apollo command module doing it floating around in the Atlantic off the coast of France?
Is there an official story in this Russian newspaper that says where this capsule came from?
Well, the implication being that they were expecting it to land, and they were there to pick it up. Now, whether they did pick it up, or whether the Americans got there first, whether the American submarine got there first to take off the astronauts who were on board, because they appeared in the Pacific a few days later, having come down on their parachute. So, as far as the Russians were concerned, they had recovered an American command module, an Apollo command module. But that wasn't reported in America. It was only reported about 30 years later when the story came out. There's a major article about it on the Owlis website.
It's interesting that the actual command module, which is the only part of the entire Saturn V rocket that actually returns to Earth, and I know some of them have been accounted for. I know the Apollo 1 capsule is locked up somewhere and no one can look at it. Does anyone know about that?
The Odyssey of the Lost Apollo Command Module. A lengthy article, but it covers it in considerable detail.
Yeah, I said I found an article on the same thing too on some site called Astronautics.
Yes. Yeah, there it is.
I found a little picture.
That's the command module that was recovered by the Soviet Navy.
All right.
Now, some people have said that that is a boilerplate capsule. But the question still remains, what the hell was it doing in the Bay of Biscay? Because it was never reported missing. It's been loaded onto the US Coast Guard cutter, the South Wind, and it was returned to America.
Since it was repatriated and the Russians gave it back, does anyone know what happened to it?
Yes, it's on display at Grand Rapids Museum in Michigan.
But it's not on display as the Apollo 13 command module.
No, it's not. I see there's a picture of it here on display. No, it's not labelled as the Apollo 13 command module. I would say I don't know where the Apollo 13 command module actually is.
The Apollo 13 command module, that's in Kansas.
That's the one that was recovered by the Soviet Navy. It's called BP Boilerplate 1227.
Yeah, that one right there, the little white triangle right there.
That's right, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
It's been sealed, so nobody can look inside it, at the Van Andel Museum Center, Grand Rapids, Michigan.
I just wanted to ask what was actually meant by boilerplate.
It's a non-functioning command module. It was used for practice. Astronauts would get on board and it would drop it into the sea and they would practice getting out of it.
Okay, right. And the other one, what Blue was just saying, is in Kansas, you said? That's the actual command module for Apollo 13.
Yes.
Right.
Okay. Here's the article on the same event from the Russian perspective. So you've got two stories here. This is what the Russians say about it. Same pictures, so we're talking about the same thing. And there's the Soviets. Now, that's the South Wind crew with the Apollo command module in the background returning from Murmansk. So it's a weird story, this one. It's a very, very weird story. There are all sorts of pictures, all sorts of accounts of ships appearing at strange times as if they were preparing to be there for this rendezvous. And the people who crewed these ships are also quite mysterious. This is the Russian submarine. It's a K-8 submarine. So obviously you can't tell where it is specifically.
I mean, I was about to ask if this had just been one that was lost and then just floated around until someone found it. But obviously the chances, if something that size is lost in the middle of an ocean, the chances of anyone finding it are pretty slim. Did it have a beacon?
Just a possibility. A tracking beacon that maybe the Russians have picked up.
It's possible, but then you do have to ask, how come it managed to drift across from Florida, presumably that's where they were using them, or somewhere off the east coast of America, to drift about 2,000 miles across the Atlantic without somebody reporting it missing?
I wonder if it's like an American version of that. They let loose a capsule with all sorts of weird technology that doesn't really exist, just to throw the Russians off course a little bit.
It could be. Certainly some reports of it. Just to go back on this map, there's Florida. That's where the Apollo, in this case Apollo 13, was launched from. There's the Bay of Biscay. So it's a bit off course because here is what is known as the Eye of Africa. It's a geological formation about 20 miles across, which is visible from space. It's known as the Eye of Africa because it looks rather like an eye, 3 circular concentric circles. As astronauts were launched out of Florida, they would fly across here over Africa, and they would watch out for the Eye of Africa so they knew they were roughly on course and got to the right continent. But of course this rather puts a kibosh on the idea that they avoided the Van Allen belts by launching to the North Pole, because you can't change direction in a spacecraft. Once you've launched it, you've got to go where it's going. You can't just go into a polar orbit. So, sorry NASA, you got that one a bit wrong. They didn't go over the poles to avoid the Van Allen belts. They went straight through them.
The idea that there's a second location where spaceships land, spacecraft come down. Now, the space shuttle was actually launched from the Kennedy Space Center. It landed, I believe it landed at, was it Edwards Air Force Base? Was that where it used to land? Which is, I think, California. But there was actually an emergency landing spot on the other side of the Atlantic. It was actually RAF Woodbridge in Suffolk. Yeah. The space shuttle, there was actually an emergency landing spot. The space shuttle, for some reason, had to come down on the opposite side of the Earth and in the other hemisphere. It had somewhere it could land. And I'm kind of wondering, I mean, obviously, maybe Blue or someone knows more about this, or maybe Scott, but was there similar plans for the Apollo missions?
Easter Island was also one of the emergency landing sites for the space shuttle.
There's varying documents on the first abort sequence that can happen on a Saturn V rocket, and you must be in space. They had to complete one full orbit on that's their first abort sequence that they could do for a Saturn V rocket. I have the documents on that as well. They wouldn't be in the Atlantic. The first one was Hawaii.
But it's a very curious coincidence or anomaly associated with Apollo 13.
But let's stick with anomaly, shall we? Because there are so many of them, it's going to take a lifetime to work them all out.
If everything else was fake, then presumably this was faked as well. I mean, why would someone fake a space disaster?
Was it because they preset the time that it was going to land and someone had spotted something about the fact that, oh my God, that's on the dark side of the moon, how are we going to get out of this one? So the whole idea of having an explosion in space was a get out kind of clause.
That's what I wrote in my book, and I didn't
Maybe I read it in yours, yeah.
Yeah. No, I'm not saying that that's the reason. I'm just saying that that was a possible scenario that could explain why they come up with that. I mean, I threw that in there just to get the reader to think and to research. There's many other possible reasons. But there's one point that I want to bring out, and Marcus was talking about the Apollo 13 landing on the dark side of the Terminator. The counter argument to that is, well, no, they would have landed slightly on the sunlit side of the Terminator. And I'm going to be talking a little bit more about this in depth in my second book, but the official versions has Neil Armstrong and the Apollo commanders of all the 6 missions doing a visual landing. We're not talking an instrument landing here, we're talking visual.
Yeah.
And in order to have an instrument landing, you need a comparable amount of equipment on the ground as you have in your aircraft. The two have to be in sync. They have to be working in tandem. So if this was a visual landing, even the argument about, well, they were slightly on the sunlit side of Terminator still doesn't hold any water for the simple reason, if you're on a visual landing and you're landing in very unfamiliar terrain, you've got shadows, elongated shadows, more different shadows to deal with. That would have to be factored into the lunar module simulations, and I haven't found any evidence that that was factored in yet anyway. So that's another thing to keep in mind. So either argument doesn't hold water for NASA.
Trevor, you've been quite quiet. Do you want to say anything?
No, I'll make a presentation next session, I think, is the... Yeah, I mean, the first book was basically impartial. I actually believe they went to the moon. Yeah, I mean, the only thing there was the chapter 19, the smoke and mirrors videos. I couldn't find any pro-NASA people who commented on that.
I don't think any pro-NASA people have commented on it because I don't think they're even aware of it. I've not seen any comments.
Well, Blue, it's your chance. Have you heard of this?
I have not.
Some homework for you, Blue.
I think NASA has commented on it. They've been pulling it down from everywhere off the internet.
That is a type of comment, isn't it?
It's still on my site. It goes with the book, so you can still see it on my site. There was one point, Marcus, that you were discussing with Blue on that last session you had.
Yeah.
About the lunar landing sites, the coordinates.
Yeah.
And if you remember, there were many different versions. I mean, for Apollo 11, and these are all NASA figures, all NASA documents that give many different versions. And on Apollo 11, one pair is 20 kilometers apart.
Yeah.
I mean, I've still got that. But what I did find from that is that a lot of those original documents have now been deleted.
Yes, I've been trying to archive as many as possible, and then I compare them with the updated files that they're putting out.
That's
I'm
interesting.
just going to share my screen now. Those are the different coordinates for 11, 12, 14, 15. If you look at the sources for all these coordinates, these are all NASA, but very different versions. I mean, these two are 20 kilometers apart. I don't know how they explain this. I mean, it was a business about whether the retro reflectors could be pinpointed. And the point is, these are just so desperately different that I don't see how it's possible. You can see the figures. I mean, this 2343, 2363, that's 20 kilometers apart.
Apollo 11, it was only 75 feet from the craft.
Those are the coordinates of the LEM.
I think it was Marcus was showing this. It looked like someone playing basketball.
About the gravity.
What I was describing was comparing a beach volleyball player here on Earth, and as he jumps up, you see the sand coming up with him, and as he goes down, the sand goes down as well. And Trevor compared that image to the jump salute, where the astronaut jumps up, and the sand also goes up, but then the sand goes back down again, and the astronaut's still up in the air. Because you can't put sand on bits of string and suspend them in the air as you can an astronaut.
I mean, what's happening there is the sand falls at Earth gravity or near enough. In actual fact, there's some slow motion added, but the astronaut's being still pulled up.
That's right.
With a wire. I mean, that's the...
This is based on the acceleration in a gravitational field and things like that, which is at a fixed rate for all objects unless there's some kind of airflow time of resistance, like a parachute, like the feather and things like that. Neil, in the meantime, Neil, you've got a presentation, I believe.
Get that on. Many will probably be aware of this movie, Clips from American Moon. It's important to know that the guy that made this film was an expert in photography, and he also makes his own films as well. So he knows about things like lens flare and film artifacts and things like that. Now, there's a point coming up here which makes me question, why did they make a ladder coming from the LEM if it's so easy for one of the astronauts to pull himself up the backside of the LEM using his arms? You'll see this in a second, which I was absolutely astounded to see. That looks like wise, definitely. Especially the weight of that backpack, you would fall back. Yeah, that's really getting pulled up. You can't do that.
That looks very weird, doesn't it?
Of course it looks weird. I mean, they're in a pressurized suit on the moon.
Okay.
I expect it to look weird.
It's interesting that you can't get up there, but not the same astronaut, but he pulls himself up literally the back side of the lunar module. And I don't know how much these suits weigh, and I know supposedly 1/6 of the gravity. But it makes you question, well, why did they bother putting a ladder there? Look, here, this is the sequence. Watch this guy. Look at that. Look at that. I mean, what sort of strength would you need to do that? You don't need a lunar module ladder, do you?
He looks like he's on a ladder.
Well, yeah, but that's
Watch his feet.
Yeah, but he's actually... Yeah, but he's swinging from side to side. There's no ladder there, because that's the back side.
Yeah, foot grips on things.
That's the back side of the lunar module.
Yeah, just look at the mess at the top with the see?
Yeah.
See up above? That is the ladder. Swinging back and forth on the wire. At one point, he doesn't even have any hands on.
Yeah. So the flap there was the thing that I was curious about. The flap where you got an astronaut dusting something like a solar panel or something on some contraption, and then he moves away, and this flap to the right of it, like a gold flap, sort of moves up and down a few times as if it's suggesting that like a breeze or something is blown on there. Any thoughts on that, Blue?
My first thought is that could easily just be the astronaut hitting it to where the astronaut's moving right out of frame. That is very zoomed in. We can barely even tell what's happening. I wouldn't see how that could be used as evidence to show that there could be wind or anything like that. Now, possibly, yeah, there could be wind on that one bit. But what I'm saying is I don't see how that can be conclusive anyway.
Possibly wind on that one bit, you mean?
Well, yeah, like if the moon landing was fake, then that could be wind. But I don't see how that single clip can be conclusive either way, seeing that it's so zoomed in and it's so low poly, to be honest.
Scott, have you got the images of the oil on the lunar rover and kind of dust stuck to the oil of the wheel rim?
I would love to know how everybody thinks that the video was faked.
Was in like how in terms of the mechanism of the...
Yeah, like how in terms of the mechanism. I mean, if you don't know, you don't know. It's just, I just want to...
Well, it's simple. Just read the Finney file. It's a complete documentation of all of the practice training, everybody that's involved, the locations they were at, how they did the geological, everything right through.
And I imagine everybody on this call has a different point of view on it. There's not one single thing that you guys have all figured out.
We all have different like opinions on things, yeah.
Of course. I mean, I was just wondering, like, going through all you guys, is it wires? Is it slowed down footage? Is it miniatures? Mix of all of them? What is it?
They used all of it.
Scott, explain what's going on here.
What you see here is oil leaking from down here. You can see it very, very wet down here. I have no idea why they cleaned off the stripe on this spot. It's perfectly clean. You can see everything sticking here, here, and here, and you can see it spraying up the inside. And the dirt sticking to it there. It's completely covered there and there. There's other shots of the astronauts, and the back of their suits are covered with the oil as well.
Could there be an argument that it could be static that's holding the dust to the metal?
No, it looks quite different. This is the only wheel where it's wet. This is the left rear wheel, and this particular rover is used on all three missions because it still has the same leaky oil wheel.
I still don't see where the oil is.
Sorry, you can't see it.
Is that the black material that seems to be spattered onto the hub?
Would that not just be lunar dust?
But then how's it sticking?
Because the lunar dust is very sticky. How is it sticking to the astronaut? How is it sticking to literally everything else? Wasn't that one of the biggest problems they found?
But you can see the difference in the wheel from the front to the back. This is oil leaking out of the rear axle on here. It's spraying up.
So where's the oil coming from that's spraying out of the axle?
Right out of the center of the hub. You never driven a car before?
Yeah, axles are filled with grease, not with oil.
Right. Well, that's where it's spraying up.
No. Axles are filled with grease.
It's coming out of here. You can see where it's coming out of.
If it was lunar dust, for instance, you would get it over the central hubcap bit in the middle, but it's actually coming out from under it. If you go back to that wheel again, Scott, like you say, yeah. See where you got the little bolts around the central cap in the middle? There's nothing there at all, but it's coming out from under it.
It's not dry, it's gooey.
Yeah. It looks like wet mud.
And this is a very distinctive mark on it here, where it's spraying up. You know, when I first found this, I emailed this to a couple of mechanics and I said, how much? Like, what's the problem? How much? And it was between $250 and $400 to fix my vehicle. That's what they did. They didn't even recognize it as the Rover. They just thought it was a dune buggy.
Scott, where's the oil coming from, if it's oil?
From the rear axle seal, right there. That is an axle seal, right there. You've never worked on a car, obviously.
Grease is in the axle. Axle grease.
Really?
Oil is in
and
the
what's behind that?
So you're telling me that the oil came out of the transmission?
Not out of a transmission, no.
Can you please demonstrate to me where the oil's in the axle?
Well, don't forget, on the other side of this is an electric motor.
Why
and
is there
it has
oil
gear, and it'll probably be using 90 weight gear oil in there. Not straight grease. Not bearing grease.
Oil will usually go in the transmission.
Same oil you put in a differential.
But it would need some kind of lubrication oil. Obviously, it's an electrically powered vehicle, but it would need some kind of grease or oil. You mentioned the differential. It's got a few moving parts. There's possibly like suspension, the springs and things like that. I mean, have you ever seen anything like this on a normal car? I mean, Scott, did you say you've seen this effect before on like a dune buggy? You mentioned your mechanic said it was a dune buggy.
Yeah,
Does that actually happen on a normal car, on an Earth car?
Absolutely. Just drive a Dodge pickup truck. The rear axle seal's leaking and all leak. Like that's lubricated right through inside the casing, right through from the differential out to the outside. Then there's a seal, and then you have grease for your bearing seals. But when that breaks through, it just leaks out everywhere. If you're on the lunar surface and it's liquid, it will evaporate.
Is there any other pictures from that same mission where the wheel is clean, as if some mechanic spotted that and said, "Cut, guys, we've got to cut. Let's get in here and let's clean this up before we carry on."
But the thing is, that's Apollo 17, and the same wheel is apparent in Apollo 16 and in Apollo 15 as well. That's the whole point. It's the same rover being used over and over again.
Is it possible that lunar dust is very sticky, and that's just the lunar dirt on the hub?
And why only that wheel then?
Slash oil or whatever.
Why only that wheel?
What do you mean why only
that wheel?
Has it too.
But they're not the same. It's not anywhere near the same.
They're not the same. I drive my car through the dirt all the time, and it's not the same on the front or the back.
Right. Why? But the other side on the back.
I can't see the other side on the back.
Not like that.
I can't see the other side on the back.
Well, then you better take a look at the photographs and study them. Instead of telling me you can't see it, then take a look.
We can't actually feel it. We can't actually see it. But it's an interesting thing that Scott spotted, and it's certainly one of the. I think it's certainly one of the things that needs investigating, if possible.
Does anyone know what might be the sticky residue on moon dust? Let's say it was sticky. What would cause that to be sticky? I would have thought some kind of moisture or liquid or something. But then, as Marcus would say, should out gas.
It's very thin oil, according to the smoke and mirrors. A very small amount of thin oil to stop the sand forming dust clouds.
I remember that. Yes, that's what gets on the suits and everything.
And the NASA position. Sorry to interrupt, Ben. And the NASA position is that they're fine molecules of grain that are almost like claws on each other, and they cling to each other, and that's why they clump together. That's the NASA argument, I believe.
I've heard it said also that because of cosmic rays, there's a lot of static charge in it, which you get static cling.
One of the things that kept coming up with the lunar module, and this is when it was being built, designed, and manufactured, that they went through great lengths to make sure that the whole entire room and building, rather, was sterilized, including the suits that the technicians themselves are wearing when they're working inside and around the lunar module. Now, I'm assuming that the argument would be that the lunar module inside, the controls, the dials would have been sealed, but still, they didn't seem to be too concerned about fluffing dust all over the place and floating around inside the lunar module, which could have the potential to interfere with fly-by-wire systems. So that's just something that I'm looking into right now.
Here's the other one that I was going to show you on here. This particular image here. This is from their training schedule. Okay, and this is from Apollo 15. And this is the equipment that they were using while they were training. just while they were practicing. So they actually had 4 cameras with 4 mounts for the front of their suits on it. These are the cameras, collection bags, and stuff like that. And you come down here, and they actually have 4 PLS mock-ups. They're not the real thing, they're just to practice with. When they're practicing here on Earth, you can't have a super heavy suit. You cannot have a 180-pound suit on an astronaut when he's practicing on Earth. This is located at Flagstaff where they were doing this practice, and it was chosen over top of any of the other locations. It's at 7,000 feet, and it's a much cooler environment, and they're going to be overheated in the suits when they're doing a full simulation. So they actually made a suit that was much lighter. The PLS mock-ups, basically all they had in them was a couple of cooling fans and a little battery and the radio set with their antenna. That's all they had in them to lighten them up. They had extra batteries, and they always had 2 rover-type vehicles on every set when they were using it. And that's when I'm showing the multiple rover tracks. Because the same thing that they were doing in their practice were the actual final simulations. This is what they took out when they were just training, but this is exactly what you see in a final simulation. The 4 PLS mock-ups are right there, right? They're not the real thing. All of the experimental equipment were just mock-ups to practice with. They weren't functional pieces of equipment. And right down at the bottom, they always had 2 rovers with them, just while they were doing the practice. That's exactly what you see in the final simulation. In the actual photographs that they claim are the final simulations are just shots from when they were practicing.
Are there 2 rovers, Scott? I mean, like you mentioned, they reuse rovers. Are there 2 rovers in each simulation? I'm like in the final, what we think
they were only supposed to have 1 with them. They were hand-built machines, so even the tracks are different. And if you watch any of my videos, you'll see that there are multiple rovers. Even the frames are built differently. But they also had 4 PLSs, mock-ups.
Okay.
They're just covered over pieces of aluminum. They couldn't possibly. There's absolutely no possible way you're going to run around with 180 pounds of equipment on just to practice in, not in Earth's gravity. That pack alone is well over 100 pounds. You wouldn't be able to bend over and pick anything else up, right? The entire stuff weighs as much as them. And if you read the Finney file, which I keep saying that you got to read the Finney file, it is an extensive file. On the training, it shows where they went for the geological rock locations. From Antarctica, they're in Nevada, Arizona, California. There's even a cinder lake in California. Schooner cone, and it gives you the date, the time, the number of people that were there, the purpose that they were going to that location for. It has like all the dates, times, everything are in that file.
So the final result of what you're talking about, what we call the Apollo visual record, was actually done on these very missions. So it was created on these missions.
Those were their training missions. It even shows how they selected Flagstaff as the final location. And it's because it had the right type of soil. Houston wanted it. They couldn't get it. It was far too warm there. They didn't have the right location or the right soil conditions to do the simulations. So when Flagstaff was chosen, they blasted out the craters and did the moonscape there. They also built Hadley Rill on that location to practice.
So they shot it outside.
They're shooting outdoor for a good portion of it. They had indoor simulations for lunar orbit, lunar landings.
Yeah.
All of those things were done on the other simulators. All of that equipment was there. They had a 120-foot high gantry crane, 300 feet by 600 feet long, to simulate the landings, and you can even see the videos on that.
How do you account for the inverse square?
What are you talking about?
The inverse square law. How do you account for that? This is not gravity. This is lighting. That if something is twice as far away, it's 4 times dimmer.
Because they're using miniature sets.
They're using outdoor sets.
Doesn't matter.
Yeah, it does matter. It absolutely matters.
Go to Daytona.
There's many lights. If you look at the ground at Daytona,
Exactly. There you go. Jeez.
There's a
How
bunch
did
of
you
shadows.
figure that out? They can light it up. Maddox,
oh my
go
God,
get an
dude.
education. Have you read any of it? None of it. You haven't even watched my videos.
If this was artificial lighting, it's a valid question.
If he wants to talk about lighting, he can read about it.
If there was like one single light, then maybe what Blue said is valid. But maybe there was more than one light. Maybe it was a large spotlight, like at a race, like a motor racing circuit, like you said,
Okay.
or maybe there were like reflector boards. I mean, Marcus, maybe you can bring. Yeah, of course.
All right. So the reason why we pretty much know it can't be one single light is because they don't make lights big enough that can go as far out as we see in the pictures. We see the sets go on very far, like extremely far, hundreds of meters in the back. And now you can say that's a miniature. Okay, then that can be a miniature. Or if there could be a backdrop, okay, there could be a backdrop. Please demonstrate how there's a backdrop. But if there's a one single light, then there has to be a drop off in that light. When you shoot movies, the whole reason why you shoot a movie outdoors for many scenes that you could shoot in a studio is because you have the one giant light. Nothing can beat that light, and that's the sun. That's one of the first things they teach you when you film anything. You can't beat the light of the sun because the sun lights everything up pretty darn evenly. That's why you want to shoot on an overcast, by the way. When you shoot in a studio, rarely will you ever use a single light to light something up. And that's because you can't light everything with a single light in a studio. You have to have multiple lights because none of them are powerful enough to simulate the sun. Now they can for a very small scene, for like a very small set, but if you want to take the entire studio set, you have to use a bunch of things. And that's why in movies you rarely see the ground. In movies you see a lot of stuff up. You don't really see the ground much. And if you do see the ground, then that's because there's a separate light that is behind the actors shooting on the ground.
You do. I mean, in some movies you do, though, Blue. I mean, like in Stanley Kubrick's 2001, you see like a location which is a studio set of the moon, which is actually not unlike what you see in Apollo.
No, it's very unlike. If you actually look at the difference between the two, they don't look anything similar. This 2001 Space Odyssey's moon set is not very good, to be honest. It looks good on film, but it's nowhere near realistic.
Okay, Scott, you have a reply for this?
Just look at the photographs. Look at the fall-off. Look at the hot spots. These photographs. I don't need to discuss it. You sit there and tell me all of this stuff.
Yeah,
look at the fall-off.
So the lighting effect you see here, Scott, is what? I mean, is this? You can see here that this is studio lights.
I mean, I've discussed this with Robert. I don't know how many times. Okay, and that's what he did for a living. Outdoor scenes.
One sec, Blue. 1 sec. So the lighting effect's not even over this landscape. Is that what you're saying, Scott?
If that's sunlight, then it would be even. And he just said that himself. I'm just showing you the photographs just in these large bitmaps, and you can see the fall off. Look at the fall off. Look at the hot spots.
Okay, Marcus, do you have anything to add to this? Because this is your speciality.
Well, yes. I mean, one point I would make about that, on some of those photographs you see what appears to be the sun appearing in the image itself.
Yeah, here and here.
There we go. But that is not how the sun would appear when photographed on photographic film. That is a large light rather than the sun. It's masquerading as the sun, and we assume it is the sun because this is taken on the moon. But if you actually examine the center of that white circle, you'll see a filament from a bulb, which indicates that there were certain pictures taken using artificial light. Now, we've got no idea what the scale of those pictures are. It could be 1.5 miles because that's the horizon on the lunar surface. We've got no idea what the scale is. So it's very hard to actually work it out. All of this was worked out well in advance on the film scripts, which were written in advance. They're called the press packs. They were all done to the nearest second, which is a very suspicious timing. That's what they intended to do. But the Apollo missions didn't carry black boxes, so we don't know what actually happened. We can only assume that NASA are telling us the truth. which I rather doubt, because so many errors have crept into their storylines. But yeah, I mean, what Blue is saying about the fall off of light is perfectly correct. If you're using an artificial light, it will fall off. The sun will not fall off. Sunlight is so powerful that there's no way it will fall off. Anybody looking at these would say, yes, there appears to be fall off in some of these pictures, which shouldn't happen if it's being illuminated by the sun. If it's being illuminated by an artificial light, yes, you will get fall off. And some of it is rather more obvious than others. And you can say, well, you can tell what size the astronaut is, so you know how big the picture is. But how do we know it's the real astronaut and not a miniature? These are some of the problems that keep arising with analyzing Apollo. It was a very sophisticated exercise in creating the Apollo archive. Very sophisticated. A lot of work went into it. My view is that it was done at Lookout Mountain Laboratories in California. The interior shots were done at the same place that Tom Hanks filmed From the Earth to the Moon, Menlo Park, near San Francisco. And some of those images, which we know were taken here on Earth, appear to show a very good facsimile of what we have seen the Apollo images allegedly taken on the moon. It's very easy to say, well, of course they were taken on the moon. You can tell, look, it's all a weird. The moon surface is very reflective. Yes, it is reflective. 8% is what it reflects. Not a great deal. But then you have to take into account the ability of photographic film to record that amount of light in relation to all the other levels of light in the same scene. And that's why most photographers will use fill-in flash, fill-in lights or reflectors. On the moon, there weren't any of these.